Hi everybody, welcome to today's webinar. Big news on the Facebook front. Mark Zuckerberg has been very busy and has made a number of announcements. When we put the registration up for this webinar last week, we got a flood of signups, and then of course last Friday there were other significant announcements, and we're going to dive into both of those significant announcements and really look forward to talking through those with you today. Okay, so let's dive right in now. So the first thing I want to talk about is what exactly has been announced. Obviously a big impact from Mark Zuckerberg directly on the media, and two specific announcements here. Back on January 11th, the major change in the way Facebook is built announcement, and everybody's familiar with that. There have been many stories written about that, and I won't talk about those details here because I'm sure you've already read about that. But last Friday, on January 19th, a significant new announcement that in many ways is more positive. It also included some quantification for the first time. The fact that now news is going to make up around 4% of the news feed, down from 5% today. So that's a 20% reduction. And everybody has been struggling to understand how much of a change this was going to be. So again, I'm sure there'll be a lot of variability across different titles and different types of properties, but this is the first we've seen in terms of actual quantification. I'm not going to dive into sort of some of the other issues around how one defines news outlets, how one defines local news outlets. There's a lot of challenges and opportunities there to be worked out, but really sort of give it a little bit of good news on top of the bad news. At least for most of you all watching this webinar, we assume that this is going to be more good news that came out last Friday. So the first thing I really want to focus on, though, is let's make sure within your organizations and for yourself that you don't frame this problem the wrong way. And let me tell you what I mean by that. I mean, there's many significant sort of negative stories out there. These are a couple of images here that went along with stories, and it made perfect sense, right? As Mark Zuckerberg's head in a mushroom cloud and a crashed test plane. Sort of these apocalyptic type visions of, oh, this is sort of the death of journalism on Facebook at least, and then usually tinged with a bit of a silver lining. What I would encourage you to do with your organizations is to focus on what you know and don't let that speculation get too far afield, because it's really easy to get carried away. And related to that is there are a lot of questions around, is Facebook my friend? Is it my foe? Can I trust Facebook? And I would respectfully say I think those are the wrong questions. I mean, they might be fun to debate and talk about, but they really miss the point as it relates to what you're trying to accomplish. And they belie specific, simplistic answers, right? Facebook is neither friend nor foe. Facebook is a company that's going to act in Facebook's interest. And sometimes that can align with your interest, in which case they're your friend. Sometimes maybe not. And can I trust Facebook is a really overly broad question. Facebook is comprised of tens of thousands of people and is a complex organization doing many different things. So trust and just saying, can I trust 20,000 or 30,000 people, implicitly on everything? Well, no, of course not. That's not true of any large group of people. So I would say that I would encourage you to reframe this as, how do I succeed in distributing and monetize my content to consumers using mobile devices? And that's not particularly elegantly stated, and it doesn't really roll off the tongue. But if you think about what you've been doing on Facebook, that's effectively it, right? That mobile consumption is a huge part of Facebook and more broadly social media. And so what you had at various points with Facebook is the ability to distribute and monetize that content to consumers on those mobile devices. And so that's what you're really trying to replace, to the degree that you can't depend on Facebook to have that anymore. Of course, Facebook still has massive scale, right? There's 2 billion people on Facebook, and we just saw at least what we think is going to be quantified around a 20% decrease. So your ability to be successful on Facebook may very well decline, but it's not likely to go away entirely. And so you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and just say, I'm done with Facebook, I'm all over it. I mean, that's not a very realistic strategy, and probably won't result in very good outcomes for you as well. So you still are going to need to pay attention to Facebook. And then this last point is absolutely self-interested. We are a social media partner and platform provider. And so with that said, you absolutely do need the right kind of partner or partners to navigate these changes. And really now more than ever, these changes just continue to come rapid fire. There's technology involved, there are APIs involved, and there are things that we're going to dive into that you're going to see specifically the technology can help you accomplish. So now more than ever is really what I would say about that. Next thing I want to move on to is we encourage you to react with controlled urgency. And I came up with that phrase because you absolutely need to react and you need to have a sense of urgency. I don't think this is the time to sit back and wait and see and not make any decisions. But you don't want to be thrashing about and guessing, at least not any more than you have to. So we don't know how big the changes are going to be specifically. We know that just last Friday, Mark Zuckerberg said from 5% to 4% if you're a news organization. But what if you're a lifestyle publication or you cover sports or those types of things. We don't know how broadly that definition is going to apply. And frankly, even with what he said, that there's often what you see in the algorithms and what you see in the real world deviates from sort of the high-level plans and what he thought or said was going to happen. So we are going to have to see and monitor what's going to happen. Point I want to raise here, though, that is important for you to think about is across the breadth of our customers, we see that 90% of the engagement comes from 10% of the posts. And it's reasonable to assume that decrease is not going to be spread out evenly. You're going to need to measure and react. And I want to show you this graph. Apologies if it looks a little bit like a math assignment here. But what's going on here is on the x-axis, you've got the total posts plotted in descending order. So if you take your very best performing post and then all the way to your worst performing post, and then you look at the cumulative engagement that comes from those, this is what you get. And so what that points out here is that 10% of the posts by number of posts comprise 90% of the engagement. And we know with the first set of changes that Facebook announced that engagement is going to be the kind of thing they're really prioritizing. So real open question whether all posts in that top 10% will decline evenly, whether they try to knock the peak off and just maybe not give such disproportionate reach to some posts. Maybe it'll focus more on the long tail. We don't know. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be continuing to think about, monitor, and of course you're going to want to look at it with your posts in your organization. My guess is your line follows the same general shape, but for you and for your content it may not be 10%, 90%, it could be 20%, 80%, or it could be even higher. We do see some variability there. So that's the engagement point. I also want to point out that the consumer still holds the cards and that their preferences continue to matter. We did a video, and you can find it on our Facebook page here, titled "The Consumer Holds All the Cards," and we used a special set of playing cards that we developed to illustrate what's going on with the news feeds, the algorithms, and the core point. I won't try to repeat the whole video. The core point, though, is that as a user, your preferences ultimately dictate what you see in your Facebook newsfeed to a large degree, and that's one of the things Facebook has been really successful at. So there's an open question as to how much the top-down direction from Facebook to saying we want to put less news content or media content in the news feed. If I, as a consumer, continue to show a strong affinity for that, is the EdgeRank algorithm going to react to what I tend to prefer as a consumer, or is it going to react to what Facebook has said top-down it wants to happen, and what's the relative mix of those things? So I think there's a lot of things that we don't really know for sure what's going to happen, and it's worth having that kind of dialogue perhaps with some of the people in your organization about what really is going to happen here. And then we move on to not drawing conclusions based on what you or your colleagues see happening in your own news feeds. And I must confess, even at SocialFlow, we sometimes fall into this trap where literally we'll pull out our phones in a meeting, we'll scroll through the news feed, and then we'll try to make pronouncements. I've done it, make pronouncements about what Facebook is doing. And if you stop and think about it, that is just honestly ridiculous, right? You can't look at your news feed and broadly conclude that that's what's happening in the news feeds of 2 billion other people, because your experience is unique. And the analogy, I came up with two analogies here. The first one, and I'm not going to get political here about global warming. I'm not making a value judgment and get into that debate, but I will say that you can't rationally debate global warming based on whether it's hot or cold outside today. And in some ways, that's what's going on if you try to do that with your Facebook news feed and say, well, I have less media content in my news feed today, at least I think I do, and then you try to broadly apply that. It's a little bit like saying it's hot or cold outside, and therefore I'm going to make a point about global warming. It's just, it's superficially ridiculous from a sort of arithmetic and logic standpoint if you stop and think about it. But we all do it. It's easy to fall into that trap. And so I'll say the other thing is that your Facebook news feed is as unique to you as your fingerprint. And so that's a good analogy to, wait a minute, you really? And you think about it, other than maybe a few edge cases, if you had only one entity you followed on Facebook, then maybe you could have the exact same experience as somebody else. But within practical purposes, if you have a dozen or 2 dozen friends and outlets you follow or pages you follow on Facebook, it's almost guaranteed that you're going to have a completely unique experience compared to anybody else in the world. And that's one of the really remarkable things about Facebook. And it also makes it really hard to draw broad and sweeping conclusions about what's really going on there. Okay, next up, let's talk about finding the opportunities and what you can do here. So first off, you absolutely should go back and revisit your post strategy, and specifically, should you be scheduling? I'm going to go into a fair amount of detail here because we still see a lot of posts being scheduled on our platform, and there are some legitimate and good reasons to do that, but the data seems to suggest there's more scheduling going on than is really supportable by what the data shows. So some more scatter plots here. Let me tell you what's going on. I'm going to show you 4 or 5 of these. These are from various individual clients or groupings of clients, completely anonymized. No, not going to give anybody's information away here. But I want to show you some patterns we see, and then you can think about how this may or may not affect your organization. So the pink dots are individual posts that were scheduled over a period of time. I think this is about a week's worth of data, and then we just basically took it all and plotted it by time of day. So it doesn't matter whether it was Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. If it was at 10 a.m., it's going to show up at that chart at 10 a.m. And you do see this vertical striping behavior in scheduling, and this is very common because we as humans tend to think in terms of even increments. Let me put a post out at 10, and then at 11, and 11:30. Maybe I go hour increments, maybe I go half-hour increments. If I'm being really aggressive, maybe I go 15-minute increments, and you see some of that there with that vertical striping. The problem is just to stop and think about, never mind the specifics of this chart, is, well, what about the time between, say, 11:01 and 11:14? Does that mean there's no available attention? The fact that we all tend to arbitrarily land on even increments means, almost by definition, there's more competition for attention at those points with things that are scheduled. And it sub-optimizes the potential. And if you contrast that with the lighter dots, which are hard to see on this, but is optimized, of course, our algorithms don't have any such bias towards even increments. They just put the content out when they think it's going to perform well, whether that happened to be 10 o'clock, 10:15, or 10:22. And there's no real sort of bias that's put in there by just our need to evenly increment things as humans. This next chart shows another problem with scheduling, and frankly, it was a problem with optimization too, is this big giant gap from 4 a.m. till 10 a.m. And by the way, this is listed on East Coast time. My suspicion is this is a West Coast-centric audience because that's sort of the middle of the night for West Coast time. So if you wondering why 10 a.m. is a relatively light time, it's 7 a.m. Pacific time. But still, I mean, the open question is, well, why would you have a giant gap there? We know that audiences are distributed geographically, and it's always the middle of the night or the middle of the day somewhere in the world. And why would you just go completely dark and effectively off air during that period of time? There's a real missed opportunity for attention there. So it's a little surprising, and it almost seems intentional that somebody's saying, I'm just absolutely not going to have any posts go out in that window. Respectfully, I would say you might want to challenge that assumption. There's some opportunity to be had there, even if it's nothing more than simply recycling posts, which we'll talk a little bit about later, and going back and just filling that window with recycled posts. This next one is really interesting. I didn't go and investigate what's going on with these scheduled posts. Generally, we know that optimized posts perform better than scheduled, but not this much better. I mean, if you look at this, these scheduled posts, I mean, they are hugging the x-axis. They are not performing well at all. My suspicion is there may be some tune-in messaging or things about these posts that they're being scheduled for a specific reason, and they're not going to get a lot of engagement. A tune-in post you wouldn't expect would get a lot of engagement, so that may be the case. It's not just our optimization algorithms. But it is pretty striking when you look at that. Other than 1 or 2 or 3 examples I can find there, I mean, everything on scheduled is almost just completely hugging the x-axis, whereas your optimized posts, you got some substantial engagement going on there. So again, I mean, we could go through hundreds of these charts. I won't do that to you. But really, just lots of opportunity, and whatever your chart shows, and you can get this from, take a downloadable message report and just simply plot this in Excel, and you can do this yourself and see how the scheduled posts perform to optimize versus publish now and immediate posts. And there's certainly a reason why you would do that at times. This last chart is a little bit frightening, but I really wanted to raise it because as we were looking at this data, it really revealed something that was quite surprising to us. So we looked at about, I think this was about 50,000 scheduled and optimized posts over a 1-week period, and the optimized posts actually had a much higher ratio of comments to shares. And so the reason we started looking at comments to shares is because in Mark Zuckerberg's first announcement about the Facebook newsfeed changes, he said they're really going to much more significantly focus on engagement, and things like sharing and commenting are more valuable than simply reactions. And so we were looking at those things, and this just jumped out at us. I don't know that we can fully explain why that's the case, but again, over a fairly significant data set, you see the slopes of those lines. That slope of the upper line on optimized is about twice of the scheduled line. So we've seen a lot better results from optimized than from scheduled. The last chart I've got here as it relates to scheduling is this is over 5.4 million posts. So this was effectively Q4 of last year. We just went in and just did a quick assessment of all the Facebook posts, and you see 62% of the posts, 62% of those 5.4 million Facebook posts were optimized. Only 15% were published now, immediate breaking news, and then that leaves 23% that were scheduled. So again, our supposition is that 23%, there's some reasons why you might specifically want to schedule something at a time. Tune-in messaging, as we talked about it, news that is embargoed and needs to go out at a specific time, and there are others as well, but probably not 23%. I think a lot of this is just natural human bias. I will say that one other thing we've seen with scheduling is having a white space in your schedule oftentimes makes people very uncomfortable. So if you turn it over to optimization, you'll see those dots all over the place, and the time will not be evenly incremented, as we talked about. And sometimes that makes either you or maybe your boss uncomfortable. Why did we go 17 minutes without a post going out? Well, I don't know. Let me schedule them for every 15 minutes so that doesn't happen again. Certainly a reasonable thing you can do if you're trying to fill the white space, but if you're trying to get results, which again, now more than ever, you need to be focusing on getting those results, you may want to go back and challenge that assumption. And there are things you can do with optimization in terms of setting the time windows to narrow the parameters. If it really does make you or your organization uncomfortable to have, a 30-minute or an hour-long window with nothing going out, you can set your optimization parameters accordingly. So that's where we are on revisiting the strategy as it relates to scheduling. Let's talk briefly about weekend publishing. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. We put this out in a white paper, I think it was about a year ago. We haven't yet updated this data to sort of reflect the new world order, but we will. But the point I want to make, and it was true then, it's still true now, is that weekends and holidays give you dramatically better performance than weekdays. And that's just the fact of the numbers there. And we've got lots of reasons why. We've done some analysis, and we believe that to be the case. Your audience does decline maybe slightly on weekends or holidays, although not nearly as much as probably what you're thinking. Historically, when people went away, they unplugged, they disconnected, they were off with their family and friends, they were off the grid, and I think we all know that's not really the case anymore. Frankly, in some cases when you're with your family over the holidays, you might be more connected because you're checking your Facebook news feed, your Twitter feed, your Instagram feed, whatever you're doing, checking in with pictures, those types of things. So the audience attention is very much there on holidays and then to a lesser degree weekends. But there's a lot less content competing for attention, and usually that's because the people who produce and distribute the content are off with their families and friends, and that makes a ton of sense. But there are things you can do either to recycle posts or set posts to go over the weekends or the holidays that will give you better results, and we encourage you to focus on that. And then I've mentioned recycling. Let's talk a little bit about how often and when you're recycling. This was, again, from that last white paper. We're going to go back and do some analysis on this again, but we continue to see significant benefits of recycling your posts, whether it be the exact same post, just recycled, whether it be 3 days later, or if it's an evergreen post, maybe it's 3 months later. It just depends on the post. You've got a seasonal post, it can be a year later. Content is an asset. It takes time, energy, talent, passion to create high-quality content. Just to get one use out of it on Facebook or Twitter or some other social network is a real shame. So there are definitely some data-driven ways to support a pretty aggressive post-recycling strategy. Facebook's algorithms, we're going to have to tune and see what they do, especially with these latest changes and how they affect recycled posts. But we very much encourage you to make that a significant part of your strategy, that post-recycling. The next 2 points I'm going to make here are not a lot of visual assets. I'll go through them relatively quickly because on this one, the rebalancing your portfolio of distribution options, Megan's going to talk about both Apple News and Google Analytics, so I won't spend a lot of time here other than saying, again, it's sort of this rebalance your portfolio is language that financial advisors use, and I think in this case it's sort of an apt analogy here. You've got a portfolio that has probably gotten overweighted towards Facebook just simply because of the performance of Facebook, and so now, given the circumstances, a good time to understand, okay, what am I doing with Twitter? What am I doing with Instagram, which, by the way, is owned by Facebook? We all know. What am I doing with Apple News? And many of our clients have been doing some things with Apple News, but we also see a lot of opportunity to do more, and we're investing more time and energy in supporting Apple News. So if we haven't talked to you about that, we'd love to do so. And then same general idea with Google Analytics is plugging in your Google Analytics data so that you can get a better view of what's going on in your websites and what's going on your social, including Apple News as you get that up and running. And so again, it gives you a better dashboard and a better insight into this balanced portfolio so you can see what's going on. So we continue to invest time and energy in making sure that you can look at problems and look at what's going on in the right way with the right data set, and again, save yourself time in the process. And then the last point, again, no visuals on this one, but it really is important, I think, for all of us to understand that labor, specifically salaries, benefits, and overhead, is probably your organization's biggest cost. And so whenever you're dealing with a change like what Facebook has said, there's anxiety that seeps into that. Does that mean that my job is secure or not secure? You're probably at an organization that's already been facing some headwinds. There's a lot of media organizations facing a lot of challenges here, and this certainly doesn't help that situation. So, just in terms of, well, what do I do about that? Well, absolutely find ways to spend less time on distribution, right? If you're going to get lower results, if your Facebook reach or clicks are going to drop by 20%, you should be thinking about at least a 20% reduction in the amount of time you spend on it, all things being equal. Maybe you can do even more of a reduction. And again, that's where tools and technology come in, and that's what we're all about, is how do we help you be more effective, more successful with less effort? And that's a classic role for data and technology to play. And obviously automating as much as you reasonably can, and emphasis on that word reasonably. We're not suggesting you just turn automation loose to publish everything out without any human intervention. That makes no sense, and really does a disservice to the high quality content that you all are producing. But there are many, many, many things that can be automated in the process, and we certainly encourage you to push the boundaries on what you've maybe haven't been as comfortable automating before, but maybe circumstances dictate that you really need to automate now, just simply to find ways to shave labor. And that way you can reallocate that labor and that time to higher value tasks that hopefully will drive top line revenue, or at the very least will drive more traffic. Next up, let's talk about that. We talked about traffic, and I want to just emphasize that for most organizations, it's not about traffic, but about revenue. There are a few exceptions to this if you happen to be a nonprofit or a governmentally sponsored organization, but for most of you out there, really revenue is what your senior executives are most concerned about, more so than traffic. And it's worth calling that out because there are things that you can and should do based on that. Even if you're not in a revenue-generating role, if you're on the editorial side, which most of you watching this webinar are, we definitely think you want to do things to preserve and extend your advertiser relationships. And this diagram is one we've used a lot here. If you think about what media companies have done historically, and this has been true for more than 100 years, they would sit between advertisers and consumers, right? You'd create content, go aggregate a consumer audience, and then sell access to that consumer audience to advertisers. And that was true in newspapers and magazines. It was true in radio and television. It was even true when the internet first came along. You still would have media companies aggregating consumer audiences and providing content to them, and then people would advertise. Of course, with the rise of social networks, in addition to all the other things that are different, what's happened is those advertisers go straight to the social networks. And that's why we've got this situation where the duopoly of Facebook and Google are sucking up such a large percentage of the advertising dollars. And then, of course, that content's going straight to consumers from the social networks. And that gets into the, well, I know I saw that content on Facebook. I can't remember where it came from problem. And so that's why I have those little danger signs there, is the weakening of the relationship between the advertisers in the media company and the consumers in the media company. Many of you all and your companies have had relationships with advertisers since before Mark Zuckerberg was born, right? But now, those advertisers are going straight to the social networks, Facebook specifically in this case, or any other social network, and advertising directly. And so that's really something that we think you need to continue to focus on. And there are things in the editorial world you can do to do that. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute here. A couple of other things you can do, and you absolutely should remember that Facebook's paid algorithms aren't affected by these changes. And it's easy to get a little confused when you're talking about, am I talking about sponsored, am I talking about organic? Everything we've been talking about, all of these announcements from Mark Zuckerberg have all been on the organic side of things, on the unpaid side. When you get into the world of paid, everything functions completely differently. And so it's worth just reinforcing inside your organization that, hey, everything that we've been talking about has nothing to do with paid. And as a result, some of the things that have been effective in paid still work, and maybe work even better, including one, using small dollars, and I say like $25 to boost high engagement posts. If you've got posts that have a lot of engagement, and we know that Facebook is going to reward high engagement, if you can provide a little bit of goose to that with some money, you can get some disproportionate results. It's probably not very palatable for most organizations to talk about giving even $25 more to Facebook right now, given all the changes in the dependency, so that may not be the move move that anybody's really eager about. But if you have a small experimental budget and you can experiment with a couple $100 a week to just see if I can take a couple of really high-performing posts and make them perform even better, that might be a way to address some of the loss in whether it be referral traffic or whatever else you're looking for from a business perspective. So I'd encourage you to at least think about that. And then native and branded content campaigns are going to continue to be as important as they have been, and nothing about these changes affects that, with the possible exception of those who were still trying to use organic reach to get and fulfill some of the traffic obligations going along with those campaigns. I think we've seen that largely dissipate because of the Facebook branded content policy that came out a year or two ago. That effectively made that a lot harder to do even back then. So there may be some folks out there now who still are trying to use organic to fulfill a native or a branded content campaign. I would suggest with this latest change, that's not really going to be an option at all. You're going to have to be paid and use paid units to drive the traffic to these campaigns and these landing pages that go along with it. But even, I will point out, even decreased organic traffic that you're getting looks really large to your advertisers. So if you're trying to have a conversation with advertisers about, hey, here's what we've got on Facebook, these are the types of content we've got, this is how well it does, you may be disappointed because you remember it used to be even higher. But if you take that and compare that to a typical advertiser's post, I mean, they effectively gave up on organic reach 2 years ago. Most advertiser organic posts to Facebook are almost exclusively around customer service issues at this point, because they just can't get any real reach, and when they do get reach, people are usually coming and complaining about it or opening up customer service tickets, that kind of thing. So definitely encourage you to just again continue to think about that narrative. It may not be you, it may be your ad teams, but you all from an editorial perspective, have a big impact on that, because you've got this amazing asset, this content out there on Facebook, in the newsfeed, on mobile devices, that's performing very, very well. And again, even if it's not performing as well as it used to, still a real win for you. This last thing I want to show you in this last slide or video in this section here is an example of one of these smarter executions I talked about, where we do it, we call it Attention Stream is the name of our product. Other of our clients call it their own name, but you can see what's going on here. You've got a video post. It was a really high-performing post around candied orange peels, got amazing traction. The post was repurposed and recreated as a paid unit. Rubbermaid was added as the sponsor to this. A 6-second video spot, as you can see, is going on in there. And so again, it's a really smart way to take your organic content and to incorporate an advertising message in a way that complies with the Facebook branded content policy, it works for the advertiser, and again, that's what SocialFlow does. We've worked through all of the mechanics of how you do this. We've got the technology. How do you identify these posts that are performing well? How do you address them from a timing perspective? How do you make sure you're delivering brand safety? There's a whole lot of things that are beyond the scope of this webinar that we'd love to talk to you about there, but it sort of illustrates the opportunity that's still there with your high-performing editorial directly in the feed. And when we talk about strengthening your advertiser relationships, this is exactly what we're talking about. So as you can see, we covered a lot of detail. We will make this webinar available for you to download and share with your organization. You can see there's a lot of material there. But for now, I'm going to turn this over to Megan, who's going to give you some of those platform-specific details we talked about, and hopefully give you some things that you can act on right now.
Thanks, Jim. Hi, I'm Megan Smith, the Director of Client Services here at SocialFlow. And today I'm going to take you through some tips and tricks to help you get the most out of SocialFlow and achieve maximum meaningful engagement. So Jim talked about rebalancing your distribution, and now is a good time to spend some time and effort on Apple News strategy. Although currently only available in the US, the UK, and Australia, Apple News has over 70 million eyeballs on it. If you are currently publishing to Apple News, you can now see your Apple News analytics in the SocialFlow interface. This allows you easier access to your analytics and lets you see it in line with your other distributed content. First here I'll show you, once you add Apple News to SocialFlow, you'll see the icon here at the top next to your other social accounts. And you'll have a queue here to build up your Apple News content within SocialFlow, just like you do with your other handles. Here I'll show you a couple of the stats that we show when you dive into an individual Apple News content item. And here we have another reporting page where you can sort all of your content by their stats, and you'll see your Apple News content in line with your Facebook, Twitter, etc. To implement this and with SocialFlow, we will need to authorize SocialFlow into your Apple News account. But this is a pretty easy step that really helps to demystify your Apple News traction. If you're interested in turning on this feature, please reach out to your SF representative or email support@socialflow.com. We're working on a lot of cool Apple News integrations for both publishing and paid campaigns. More to come shortly. Another cool reporting feature is our integration with Google Analytics. This feature, once activated by your client admin, is found in your Reports tab in the Audience section, and shows you in real time what your most popular site content is. So this number shows how many visitors you have currently on your website in real time. It's highlighting what people are meaningfully engaged with on your website. So you can use that as an indicator of what your social following may find engaging as well. You can also see if this content appears either in your queue or has already been published to a social account. And then if you want to, you can push it out again. There's a compose button here. So if it hasn't been shared yet, you can post it to any number of your social accounts from there. Now, the last few things may be very simple and you may have heard them before, but I think they're worth calling out because there are some easy ways to find your high-performing content and get more out of them. So here in SocialFlow, we'll go to the Messages page. And you'll see all of your posts and tweets from here. You can sort by any of these stats, and you'll also be able to sort by visitors as well. So that information from the GA integration is also here. But more importantly, you can sort by the shares, which is, as we were told, highly valued now with Facebook. So you can sort all of your content by the highest number of shares, and then if it makes sense, if you want to, you can recycle from there, reuse that content again. Now, another feature you might already know about is labeling. So going back to the Publish page, you'll see every item in the queue has a label option, and you can even label things after the fact, after they've published. But the label option will allow you to categorize your content into different categories or buckets of content. And then in the reporting section and the downloadable reports, there is a label report option. So you can compare different categories of content and see which type of content is actually driving the most engagement. And the labels are fully customizable. You can type in any name here that helps you. Now, another tip we want to talk about is weekend publishing. We've noticed that more and more, since there's less competition, let's say, on the weekends, more clients are getting better engagement or more engagement now with the weekend publishing. So just remember here in the compose box, you can always select a weekend time frame if you like, say Saturday morning to Sunday evening, and you can fill in that exact times here. But another tip is to go into the account settings here. You'll find that there are publishing rules. And what some clients are doing now is on Friday afternoons, you can customize these publishing rules for the weekend itself. So you can publish a little more, a little less, make sure that it's regular. You can fill a bunch of optimized can send content into the queue for the weekend, and then let these rules dictate how often you publish for that weekend time frame and just adjust it on Monday morning. I hope you found these features and tips helpful. Should you have any questions, please reach out to me or my team. I'll include some videos and other resources and a follow-up email about some of the things we talked about today. Back to you, Jim.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks to you all for joining us. You can send an email to support@socialflow.com if you're a SocialFlow customer, or you can send it to sales@socialflow.com if you're not yet a SocialFlow customer. But we'd love to continue to talk with you. We really hope you have a great day.